It's very much about reading the times. Like we talked about, if you go back to the early Christians, there was an existential condition called Gnosticism, and Christianity comes out of it with like a new message. For me, the limits to this fascination with psychedelics is once you understand something that Carl Jung said, and Carl Jung, he said there is no better tool for convincing people about the truth of the scientific materialist worldview, so not the spiritual world, the scientific, then psychedelic. Because if psychedelics can give you an experience that is invariably described as divine, mystical, metaphysical, godlike, and psychedelics are a chemical compound, then
It's all chemical.
it's all chemical.
The orthodox answer was, forget about all this gnosis. It's really complicated. Just have faith, and then you're in. And it's a
Yeah.
more simpler answer to this predicament that they're all in. Sort of bringing people into a direction that, as we pointed out, life denying.
Yeah.
The Nietzsche's Life of Tragedy is, he gets into like this idea of before Christianity,
Yeah.
you had this Apollonian Dionysian duality, and there was art. And people were driven by art and the music and the muse, and it was life affirming, and it was life is tragedy, but it's beautiful, and that's what he really expresses in that book. But then you look at the Christian answer to life, and it's, to me, it's just like
It's comedy.
yeah, but it's almost
No,
like
no, no. Listen,
Let me
it's
hear it.
comedy in the way that the Divine Comedy from Dante is comedy, because it was not a tragedy, because everyone gets saved at the end.
Yeah, and that is funny if that's true.
Hello everyone, this is Michael from Ancient Greece Revisited, and we're back with a fascinating guest. I want to introduce to you a person who you probably already know and who's done great things in the space and who's been very kind to us and our channel. He's called the Gnostic Informant, and we will just call each other Neil and Michael.
Sounds easy to me.
Thank you very much for being here, man.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
I hope you had a great time
I'm having
visiting
a blast.
Greece. So you're here on a bit of an expedition,
Yes.
right? And a bit of a spiritual quest. So just what are the first snapshots, the first impressions on that plane?
So I got here, and first thing I did to go to the Acropolis, go to the museum, hit up all the locations that are in Athens, like the Areopagus, stuff like that. And then we, started going along the outskirts. We went to Cape Sunion, Temple of Poseidon, in front of the camera work there, Delphi, Eleusis, Thebes, Mycenae, Temple of Asclepius. I went to the sanctuary of Pan in Arcadia, visited the locals. I've been on an adventure this entire time.
What was the common thread? What was the thing that connected everything? What was the quest?
I'm here to explore the revival of ancient religion from pre-Christian times. And I'm also talking to Christians here. I talked to a priest here. I have another interview scheduled in a couple days with the Orthodox priest of an old 11th century church. Great guy too. I'm just trying to get the sense of what it's like on the ground. Because you hear a lot of things I live in the United States, and there's a lot of talk on the internet. There's a lot of what we call LARPers, people who pretend to be doing revivalism, but they're just online doing it. They're not really serious. They're just trying to pretend that they're doing it. But I wanted to come to talk to people who are really serious about this, in which you've introduced me to some of these people, and talk to them, and even just pull some people aside on the street. Like I did yesterday in Arcadia. I just pulled a guy and asked him, what do you think about this sanctuary over here? And get their thoughts on it.
I'm just going to stay there. What were the thoughts? Because you're talking about people who live a very rural life.
Yes.
And all of a sudden they have a temple dedicated to Pan and Zeus being erected right next to them.
Yeah.
What do they think of that?
I actually thought there was going to be rejection from most of the older people, because Orthodox Christianity is huge here. I witnessed for the first time ever the Pascha, and I grew up Catholic in the United States, and Easter Sundays are half an hour long. Everyone can't wait to leave and go home and eat dinner.
Did you have a proper Good Friday Epitaphios
Yes,
and
I
apostasy.
attended an Orthodox church and I saw the 3 hour long Pascha. Everyone's attentive. Everyone knows the liturgy.
Mm,
Everyone's like into it. And it's an older crowd. I should say
mm.
that there wasn't a lot of younger people there. So I want to make that
It
very
really
clear.
depends on the church, though.
That's true. I only saw one
Mm,
church, so
mm, mm.
this was my experience. However, so I was expecting to hear some people pushing back, but there really wasn't a lot of that. I think people are more united by being Greek than they are
Ah,
about religion. I know this is something that
very
fascinated me.
interesting.
I did
It's
not
very
expect this.
interesting.
Christians don't necessarily, some of these Christians, I should say, the ones I talk to, don't necessarily have any hatred for some of these people that are
Mm,
going to other options, and vice versa. The
mm,
people
mm,
who are
mm,
going to revival Greek religion don't hate Christians.
mm,
They're united as Greeks,
mm.
and that was actually pretty beautiful to notice that.
It's a very interesting angle. Yeah, I mean, we had our time there in Arcadia, and we did an interview with Bexis and his work, and then we heard that he got into trouble with the
Yeah,
authorities, and people tried to shut it down, and they used our video as a kind of introduction on some local newspapers, which was very interesting. But when we posted that video on our channel, the comments almost took us back to the 3rd century AD. You know, there were people who were
yes,
like, "You're demon worshippers, get out." And
that's what I mean about the internet. The
yeah,
internet says one thing, and sometimes on the ground is
on the
another thing. And I noticed that on the internet, it's very one-sided, or
yeah,
either they're
black and white. Yeah,
pro-Christianity and
yeah,
hate the pagan devil worshippers, or they're completely 100% pagan and hate Christianity.
yeah,
Christianity
yeah,
ruined the
yeah,
world,
yeah,
Dark Ages,
yeah,
that
yeah.
third. But it's noticed
Well,
on the ground.
it was shockingly divided. I tried
Yes.
to stay out of it, but it was shockingly divided. And that is a general frustration that I have with the internet. There's people who write comments on our chat, and I'm thinking like, who is
Or
that
do they actually
person?
mean this
Do they actually
sometimes?
mean it? And who is that person
Yeah.
who wrote like two
2
pages of
pages.
half
Yeah.
comprehensible, pulling different strands of mythologies and being convinced that he's right about something I don't even understand?
Tell me about it.
I'd like to like meet him like I'm meeting you,
Yeah.
and I'm sure I'd get a different perspective.
But
But
you brought up a good point, though, that even though I did mention the people I met surprised me and how um, not,
partisan,
yeah,
unpartisan.
but there is some struggle and
Mm,
there is sort of a beef going on. And some of these priests do reject. Some of them are blaming, I've seen someone blame the earthquake in Santorini on people leaving their
yeah,
Christianity
yeah.
and we need to go back to the church. And on the flip side of that, or and then in your article that you pointed out, you had this priest saying this is a religion of a bygone era
Mm-hmm.
of where they did horrible things and they're
Mm-hmm.
basically just barbaric and then but then like you said, you also get people who really cannot stand the Christian dogma
Mm-hmm.
and they really are they just think it's the problem right now.
Yeah. Well, you will never get away, you will never surpass this because it's true that historically the two aspects, the pagan and the Christian, came into violent conflict.
Yeah.
And it's also historically true that a lot of this conflict was initiated by the Christians. There's
Yeah.
no doubt about that. And that a lot of the Christian dogma was formed almost as a contradistinction to the pagan world.
Yeah.
There's aspects of Christianity that are, philosophically negative. They're a negation of paganism. They're more unpagan than Christian. Um, and that's ingrained in Christianity, so you can't really take it away. There's always going to be this conflict. For me, where we are and the reason why I may find aspects of this conflict ridiculous is because neither is giving us the food that we desire. Now, one of the reasons I'm doing this is because I just see people desiring something. Like recently, I just had a phone call from, a person who is doing a documentary in a place called Portocelli. And he said, I'd like you to present some. And I'm like, I wish I was getting these calls from my actual business. But people are picking this aspect of my life and they're looking for more. And neither Christianity nor paganism are giving us the nourishment that we desire. Are we doing it wrong? Are we doing Christianity wrong? Many out there are going to say yes. We haven't fully embraced, although you have a fascinating story that I want to get out. Some people might say we're not doing paganism. I say we're all looking for the third thing, and third thing has yet to come. We are looking for a new revelation. That's what I believe. So that's part of my journey. But you mentioned about LARPing and
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you about that because that's kind of what Christianity did. Is there was the old religions, there was local cults, and Christianity wanted to, bring itself into the common era, which is what you call it now, a new path, something different than what was done before.
Yeah.
You're saying both of those traditions are pretty much outdated and something needs to go forward in this modern world that we're in. That's interesting.
Exactly. That's what I believe. I feel it. I can't prove it. They have lost their steam.
Yeah, and to go back to the LARPing thing, this is one of the reasons why I been hesitating so long to even call myself pagan. Well, number one, that term pagan is a derogatory term that the Christians sort of gave to the people who didn't convert, because you guys are uneducated, you guys are rustic hillbillies, so you're a pagan. No one called themselves pagans, but anyways, people do now. But also, I believe in the muse. I do. I've told this. I've said this on my channel. I believe in being inspired by something beyond us. So I do believe in aspects of what we would call paganism. But the reason why I hesitate to call myself that is because I don't have a necessarily home or a structure or a priesthood or a place to go. I just feel like this is something I believe in. I just don't know what it is yet. But then you see the people online who call themselves pagans, and they're like me. They believe in something. Great. We agree on that. We both believe in the idea of the muse. But like, what are you doing every day? Do you have an altar at your house? Do you go to a temple?
How is your life different? How is your everyday life different than if you were not a pagan? Like, do you cook differently? Do you make love differently? Do you run your business differently? Do you work differently? Do you create differently?
I honestly have to say no.
Yeah.
It's just, that's why I never say I'm a pagan.
Precisely.
Because I believe in this concept. I go back to the ancient text and I look at the poets and Pindar and Homer, and I feel like that's what I'm into. I read the Bible and I go, I'm not into that. I read Homer and Pindar and Aeschylus and Sappho. I'm into that. But as you said, I don't have the structure. I don't have a priesthood. I don't have a home, so I can't call myself that.
And
it feels like LARPing.
Yeah, and it brings us back to a subject that we've discussed privately and we've both noticed, and it's crucial to bring out, that a lot of these so-called pagans, with their often so-called paganism, it's just a mask over their Christian beliefs. They're still Christian at their core. They just put a different mask. They don't realize it, they don't admit to it. But essentially, they're doing the same thing with a different name.
Yes. And that's kind of where Gnosticism comes in.
Exactly. And to understand all that, we have to go back to Gnosticism, which is part of your life's work.
And if you think about early Christianity, I'm talking beginning, square one, before the Gospels, during the Gospels, and right after the Gospels. So we have the histories that we get from the church talking about these heresies. And these heresies go back to Simon Magus, who lived in the time of Paul and Peter, or I should say, according to the book of Acts. So this is going back to before there was any like Christian church. These were just Jews and Samaritans, and people call themselves magus. This was part of the tradition. Jesus is performing miracles. He's healing. That's what a magus would do. He kind of was a magus himself. Some books I've written on this. Anyways, we find this early pre-church hundreds of sects. I was going to say dozens, but it might be over 100 different sects and denominations of Christians that are reported by Epiphanius, Hippolytus, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, and I can go on and name the Carpocratians, the Simonians, the Valentinians, the Sethians, the Nacenes. I can just go on and on. And the thing about them all, they are all completely different from each other.
Yet they all believe they're Christian.
Yeah, and we call themselves Gnostics now. Some of them might have called themselves Gnostic. I think the Nacenes actually said, we are
I think what happened there is a little bit what happened through the works of Plato. Through Plato, we make a big distinction between the philosopher, exemplified by Socrates, and the sophists, who are like these second rate, they do it for the money, they have dubious morals, and the philosopher is like, on his way to ascend to the gods. Back in the day, there was no distinction. There were these people who had a method of thinking about the world and had just recently transferred it to thinking about political and moral affairs. They took a method that was meant to understand the revolution of the planets, and they turned it to understanding social affairs. That's what Socrates... The distinction between Socrates and someone like Protagoras was not clear to your average Athenian. For Plato, it's like you can cut it with a knife. There's the first-rate and second-rate thinker. But Protagoras and others were first-class thinkers who are now overshadowed by the figure of Socrates because of a specific choice made by Plato.
By putting him in the dialogues.
Likewise, if you were to go back, now, because history is written by the winners, and in the case of the Bible, you have a very specific line of thinking that persevered.
It becomes orthodox.
And
that's what I was getting at, is that these groups that we now call Gnostics were all completely different. They were unified by some things, loose things that bring them together.
What was the something?
And the Valentinians were Pythagoreans, for example. But they're also Christians. They also read the Gospel of John. That was their central text. Some of these groups only had one gospel central to them. Some of them had none of the four gospels central to them, but read other weird gospels. But the point I'm making is, today, in this new theosophy, new age world, it's sort of like that again. Where you have all these different groups. Some of them are on the internet. Some of them are local on the ground. You might go to England and find, some Norse pagans over there. And they're all very different from each other, but they're all sort of yearning for something similar of each other.
Exactly.
And it's sort of like that Gnostic age is back.
Exactly. This is where I want to focus. Because there was something that, like for an Orthodox Christian, all these other groups that you mentioned, the Sethians, the Carpocratians, were abominations, right? A lot of them had a sexual morality that was more liberal.
According to the later.
But
I will say this, though. I want to say it because some of these groups, you're right, were probably looked at bad in a negative way while they were around. I would say the Cainites, for example, they were very extremist. They were calling the God of the Old Testament the devil, basically. They're saying Cain was good, Abel was bad. Those groups, okay, we can all look at that and go, they probably were looked at in a negative way. But other groups like Carpocratians or Valentinians, Valentinus was in Rome in the 140s and was this close to becoming the Pontifex Maximus, which he would have been on our list of popes today. Marcion was another one of these figures who was high up in the church. His father was Philologus, who was one of the 70 disciples mentioned in Luke Acts. That's Marcion's father. So while they're alive, they're part of the church. Later on, they look back and go, heretic.
I think the best metaphor, and I took it from Nixie's second book, which talks, I think it's called The Other Sons of God, which talks about all these Christian sects at the earth. And she says, when we read the early centuries of Christianity, it's like watching a race, knowing the result. We know that, I think we had this discussion privately where, if you watch Muhammad Ali, George Foreman rumble in the jungle, you know who wins. So everything looks like it's leading up to the victory. Like Muhammad Ali, he looks tired, he looks beaten, but it's just a strategy to make the other fighter tired. When this fight was happening, it was that close.
Anyone could have won.
Anyone could have won. In retrospect, it all looks like it couldn't have been any other way.
Think about Valentinus winning the election.
Exactly.
He might have done things in power to change the direction of the church.
Exactly. So now, you look all these other heresies, you say, of course.
Of course they're wrong.
Like drinking snake venom and thinking that Jesus was actually the snake in the Garden of Eden. I think the Sethians.
But then you look at John's gospel and Jesus says, you will have power to drink snake venom and stand on scorpions.
Exactly.
So they're not. They
These
have
echoes
reasons for this stuff. Yeah.
exist, yeah. But now, because our mind is so conditioned by the people who actually won,
Right.
who are the Orthodox Christians, and they look down upon all these heresies, and they will twist and turn some elements and make them even more exaggerated. We never hear their version of the story.
Right.
And
We
why
only
they
have
thought,
one side of the story. That's very important for us to mention.
why would anyone make the connection between Jesus and the snake in the Garden of Eden? It sounds absurd to an orthodox formed mind.
But then you read John and it says, the serpent was lifted up in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man also be lifted up.
Yeah.
And then you go, that does sound like someone can pull some theology from that.
Exactly. So let's go back to when the battle was being raged, when Muhammad Ali was up in the ropes.
It's my favorite time of history, by the way.
Yeah. So. I have found that understanding Gnosticism is the key to understanding what was happening in this era that gave birth to the modern world in some way. So, take the lead, introduce us to, if someone was to ask you for a primer, Gnosticism 101, what is it? Why should we care about it?
I would start by saying this. Today we look at Mormons and Catholics, or here in Greece, Orthodox Christians, as completely opposites. The Mormons have different textbooks. They have the Book of Mormon. They have different prophets, Joseph Smith. They even think of God as not really the Trinity. They're not Trinitarians, they're Unitarians. They have all these different doctrines. But Mormons and Catholics or Orthodox are united on the major aspects of Christianity. They believe Jesus rose from the dead and is now God. They believe that. However, you would think that those divisions that I talked about, how separate, how different a Mormon is of a Catholic, is because of a long difference in time, and this church went in that direction, that church went in that direction, and over time you have all these thousands of sects and denominations: Baptist, Evangelical, Lutheran, Anglican. I can go on and on. I mean, all these different groups, but they all have different differences, of course, but they have more in common today than the earliest Christians had in common. Take any early Christian group. Look at the Valentinians. They were doing some weird Pythagorean gematria stuff. They had different triads than the Carpocratians, who said that you can become God, or God-like. You can become apotheosis. They did a deification of a man named Epiphanes in 117 AD on the island of Kephallonia. That is completely different from each other. Yeah. So the earliest Christians...
That is heresy in the modern sense.
It is now, but at the time, this was just Christianity. So the earliest Christians from the late 1st, early 2nd century were farther apart from each other than Christians are today. And we think Christians today are so far apart from each other, and they're actually not. So you would think the closer to Jesus, the more in line everyone's going to be, because you're going to the source. It's the opposite. The farther back in time you go, the closer you get to Jesus, the more different all these Christians become. It's the exact opposite of what you would think.
Which is the opposite of what you think. Because the story that we've been fed is that there was Jesus, there was his teachings, people heard it.
And then Peter, Paul, James.
And then some people just corrupted it.
Yeah, you have Peter, Paul, James, and then they deliver the messages to these churches. And then it gets different over time. But it's actually the opposite.
Exactly. You think it's like a big bang.
It's a big bang, exactly.
But it's an opposite big bang, where the closer you go to the source, the more diverse
it gets. And I can even give you some examples. You have the Carpocratians, as I pointed out, who had this doctrine of apotheosis, where they look at Jesus not as necessarily the only person who's the Son of God, and he's the only person who was chosen to have the mind of God, the nous, as the Valentinians would say. No, they said, if you have gnosis and you train your brain to think like God thinks, then you become begotten by God. And that's why the Carpocratians had a doctrine that they only read John, first of all. And in John's gospel, there's no birth scene. Why is that? Luke has a birth scene, Matthew has a birth scene. John does not have a birth. Jesus is born when he's baptized in John. There's talk about the Carpocratians doing their baptism was their biggest ritual, right?
And the Gospel of John is the only gospel.
That's
where
the only gospel that was
Jesus,
central to them.
because that's the only gospel that Jesus mentioned him as being God.
Yes, but they thought because of his baptism, he became begotten and he attained gnosis, apotheosis. So they taught that anyone can do this. They even said, according to the sources, Pythagoras became divine. They had statues of Pythagoras. Socrates became divine. Plato became divine. There's a few figures from ancient Greece that became, in their minds, became divine. But they had images of Jesus, images of Mary, images of Pythagoras. And these are people in ancient history who they said attained apotheosis, and you can too.
So there were versions of Christianity that would fulfill this yearning of a national unity for Greeks much better than Orthodox
Yes.
Christianity. There were versions of Christianity that would look upon this ancient as not just their crude predecessors, but as actually almost equal.
So you had the prophets on one side.
To Jesus.
Yeah, the prophets on one side in the Old Testament, Isaiah, Micah, Hosea, and they're all pointing to Jesus. But there's these early Christian groups from in all these cities like Ephesus and here in Athens and Philippi and Corinth, who are saying, well, yeah, the prophets, they pointed to Jesus, but our philosophers were paving the way, this sort of attitude of what would be like, what Christianity would come and fulfill us. And so you get sort of a marriage between the Greek and the Hebrew, in that Marcion was one of these proponents of, well, the Old Testament God was some other divinity. The real Father of God was this perfect God that the Platonic God.
This is where I want to get. So you have all these different versions of Christianity that we are talking about now as being as authoritative, despite what Orthodox Christianity would like us to believe. We understand that, these were people that heard the message from someone who heard the message from Jesus.
Yeah.
They were that close. They were 1, 2...
Even Justin Martyr.
Yeah, 1, 2, 3 links away from...
They're very close,
from Jesus.
And even Justin Martyr, who's living around 150.
And yet they're convinced that Jesus was a snake in the Garden of Eden.
Some of them.
That's what or they're convinced
it's very important
that Pythagoras was divine and Plato achieved divinity.
But it's very important to people to understand, when we talk about specific doctrines, like the snake one, that's a Sethian doctrine. That's the Sethians believed that. The Valentinians didn't believe Jesus was the snake. The Nacenes did believe he was the Nacenes are the snake handling one. Certain groups did, certain groups didn't. They all had their own doctrines.
Yeah.
But I want to point this out. Justin Martyr lived in around 150. He also held to this idea that the Greeks and the philosophers were divinely inspired and sort of leading towards the birth of Christianity. And then all the way to Eusebius, who wrote a text in the 4th century called Preparation for the Gospel, Preparatio Evangelica, where in that text, he's going, okay, we know that the Old Testament is prophesying Jesus. We know Moses talked about Jesus. But let me tell you about Pythagoras and how he prophesied Jesus. Let me tell you about Zoroaster and how he prophesied Jesus. This is in the 4th century. This is post the Nicene Creed. And these ideas are still there. They're still going the Greeks were great and they were part of our tradition.
So even then the Christian doctrine had not fully crystallized into what
so some of these remnants,
fluid. It was still fluid.
I'll even argue that the Trinity has some aspects in some of the early Gnostic groups, the Valentinians, who I mentioned. When the Valentinians were around, there was no Trinity yet. There was the Valentinians whose central book to them was John's Gospel. They didn't read any other Gospels but John. John was big for a lot of these Gnostics for whatever reason. Probably because it's got the logos, it's very Greek, it's got the true vine, has some Dionysian aspects. Anyways.
It has a poetic
It's very poetic. You can see why the Greeks like John.
Yeah.
But Valentinians, we're looking at John 1 in particular, where in Greek it says Theos is the logos, and the logos was with God. And this logos was the light. In him was light, Zoe, and this Zoe was the phos, the light of the world, and the truth, aletheia. And then you read the Valentinian sources, and they are making a triad out of that: logos, Zoe, Theos. Theos is the father of God, the mind, the nous, like Zeus. Jesus Christ is the logos, as it points out. But then you have this other aspect of Jesus called the life, Zoe. It's retelling Genesis. In the Septuagint, Genesis, the woman that comes from Adam's rib is called Zoe. It's a dyad. So you can see that a proto-trinity in the Valentinian sources. Now, Orthodox people were saying, no, the Valentinians didn't give us that. They were heretics. Well, the triad was heretical according to Irenaeus. Irenaeus was not a Trinitarian. Hippolytus also says that the triad, which, by the way, the word in Greek for Trinity is triados. It's the same word. There's not one word for triad and one word for Trinity. They're calling this a Trinity. This was heretical in the 2nd century.
Because it reminded of paganism.
It was from the
reminded
Valentinians.
Of many gods.
Exactly.
You're breaking God apart
and
into
then
many.
to top it all off, let's fast forward to the 4th century when the Trinity does get accepted and they do make a council of Nicaea and say everyone needs to believe this Trinity. The proponents against the Trinity, the Arians, Arius himself, called them Valentinians. He goes, you guys are a bunch of Valentinian heretics for believing in the Trinity.
And yet their belief is now the Orthodox belief.
That's the Orthodox. So he's literally calling them Valentinians for believing in a Trinity. Meanwhile, they're going, no, we believe this now. And they look back at the Valentinians and go, they were heretics.
But no, it's fascinating. But I would have, again, laser focus on the phenomenon of Gnosticism. Okay, because having this conversation, and what I noticed is that Gnosticism is so wide, it was never a religion the way Islam or Christianity. It was a religious tendency, a religious orientation.
Yeah, like we find in the Greek magical papyri where they're mixing and matching Osiris and Jesus. Yeah,
but that's
very
the thing.
Chaotic.
So it's so wide that people who try to tackle it and answer the question usually focus on one aspect. There's this famous book by Helen Pagels, I think.
Elaine Pagels.
Helen Pagels, one of the early books on Gnosticism that kind of opened the subject up to Western audience.
Right.
And her Gnosticism is essentially, the Christian Gnosticism is essentially a Christian sect in a way. But Gnosticism is far wider than that. And I think to understand it, you have to zoom out and look at its extent and say, there was a Christian Gnosticism through the works of the apocryphal, the so-called apocryphal Gospels, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas. There was a Greco-Egyptian Gnosticism with the works of Hermes Trismegistus.
Yes.
You have a more proper ancient Greek Gnosticism with Orphism, that is a very, very ancient religion, possibly predating the Homeric one, but gets Gnostified as it progresses towards the Common Era.
You had this group called the Nasenes living in Asia Minor in the 2nd century. They were led by a man or maybe a woman, because it doesn't say what gender he is. I think it's probably a man, just because it doesn't. I think they would specify if it was a woman
in the time.
But someone's pointing out to me, hey, we never actually say it's a dude. Anyways, someone named the Nasene preacher, probably a dude, living in Asia Minor, Phrygia. They even call themselves Phrygians, by the way. And this guy was comparing Jesus to not only for some reason mainly Attis, who Attis. Let me just take a quick detour. I'll come back to what I'm saying. During this time period, in the middle of the 2nd century, there was a Roman festival called the Hilaria that happened during the week of what was at the time Easter, because they had during this time, there was a fixed spring equinox. Now our spring equinox moves because we have a different calendar. This time it was March 25th. During the Holy Week, the same thing they call Easter Holy Week.
In Roman times.
Yeah.
In
and
pagan
they do now too.
Yeah.
We call Easter Holy Week. Here in Greek, they're calling it that. In Rome, they called this the Holy Week during the spring equinox. And they have a festival dedicated to Attis and the Great Mother, where they bury the dead effigy of Attis on a tree. And I think me and Stephen were in church, and we heard someone say, on this day Christ was fastened to a tree. And I'm like, whoa, that's like the same thing that happened to Attis. Anyways, they bury the tree on a pine tree. They bury him on March 22nd. I think it's March 22nd. On the 3rd day after that, they go into mourning for 2 days.
Yeah.
and they go in the morning. On the
then
third day,
he gets resurrected.
they call it the Hilaria, which
Yeah.
means in Latin rejoicing.
Mhm, mhm.
And they say, according to Firmicus Maternus, who's writing later in the 4th century, but he's what he says. He says that the priest cries out, "Our God has been saved, and we are saved through his sufferings." This was an Addis festival. Now,
What year?
so according to John Liddis, another late source, Claudius instituted these rites. Now, there are some scholars who say, I would like to see more concrete sources about what Claudius instituted. He might have instituted something different, and it might have grew like this over time. Some scholars think Christianity influenced this. I don't. I don't think the Romans are looking at Jewish cults to adopt things. I think it's the other way around. They're the Beatles. They're the Roman imperial cult. They're the big religion everyone's looking at. I think it's the other way around. But anyway, that's another topic. The point is, by the time we get to the 150s, we know for a fact that all these rites were already instituted because Marcus Aurelius added a new day called the Day of Washing. And we also know that Antonius Pius also, there's a source about what he was doing during the Holy Week of Addis. So during this time, when the Phrygian Christians, called the Nazarenes, are worshiping Jesus, the Nazarene preacher, according to Hippolytus, told his students to go and visit the Hilaria, because in the rites of Addis, you will see the rites of Christ, which is, whoa, that is so heretical. These are pagan Christians. The Nazarene preacher, in what's called the Nazarene hymn, you can look this up, it's all over the internet. He compares Jesus to not only Addis, but also Dionysus. He also compares him to Adonis. It's a beautiful hymn. It's from the Homeric hymn to Addis. I don't know if you ever heard this, where he says, "You are the son of the great mother, Phrygian Addis. Some Egyptians call you Osiris. All of Greece calls you Bacchus. All of Syria calls you Adonis." And he goes through the list of all these sons of God characters, and this is Addis being compared to him. But what this Nazarene preacher did, he crosses off the name Addis and puts Jesus on there. And he says Jesus was called Osiris, he was called Dionysus, he was called Adonis, he even calls him Pan. Whoa, right? So he's saying all these characters are. So what I'm basically saying is these Nazarene Phrygians were like pagan Christians of the 2nd century.
Yeah, but there's one element I think that's missing, because like, I get bombarded about ideas that usually come from this documentary called Zeitgeist.
Yeah,
the first one. And what you said is pretty much
everyone always brings that up when I get into these subjects.
A summary of that.
Well, they made a lot of stuff up that isn't true.
They made a lot of stuff
This
up.
is primary sources.
To be fair, because I follow the guy who did it online.
Joseph.
Like, look.
Peter Joseph.
This was an artistic project.
Yeah.
He was a musician and he created.
He used bad sources.
But it wasn't about good scholarship.
No, it was bad.
About background. It was literally the way he explains it.
Yeah.
He had a concert and he wanted some cool visuals in the background. So he stitched up a few videos that would play, because I think his music was instrumental.
Yeah.
So the voiceover.
He ruined this. He ruined this entire discourse, because what I just said.
Well, he opened it up for a lot of people.
He damaged it. Because
you think?
What just happened just now is I brought up primary sources that are real primary sources and Zeitgeist. And then boom, now this whole entire thing shut down. But these are real primary sources. But they need to be, I think, discussed.
But here's what I'm saying. Yeah. The reason I bring it up is that because that is very exciting to a lot of people.
Yeah, it was a huge documentary.
Exactly.
But the scholarship, for good reason, shut it down, because the whole thing was done wrong.
Yeah.
They made it all about astrotheology, and they said that all these other gods were born of a virgin, had 12 disciples. Horus was dead for 3 days and resurrected. That's not true. None of the sources were. In fact, even Addis, that I just brought up, in the myth of Addis, none of that happens. It's only reflected in the Roman tradition,
the Roman tradition.
And that's very important to point out.
But what I'm saying is that with good scholarship or with bad scholarship, with primary sources or with a video that was meant just as a background, some music festival, you have this core idea that Jesus is essentially a rehashing of what some scholars have called the ever rising and ever dying
The
God.
dying and rising God, yeah.
The dying
James
and the rising God.
Fraser.
James
Yeah.
Fraser brought this up. Arthur Evans, who excavated Crete to uncover the Minoan civilization,
Yes.
brought it.
This would
again
have been
back.
this would have been top scholarship for 1900 to 1950.
Exactly.
After 1950, this gets shut down.
This gets shut down, apart from people like Joseph Campbell,
Yeah.
who carry it through the 60s and the 70s and the 80s,
Yeah.
keep on, presenting it. There's obviously things there, undeniably, and you just mentioned some primary source. But there's an element to the Jesus story which I think sets it apart.
Absolutely. I agree 100%.
And we shouldn't just go, oh, he's just another Dionysus. Oh,
No, I don't think so.
Exactly.
I don't think so. Yeah.
I
don't even think the Nicene preacher thought that.
Okay.
I think what the Nicene preacher was doing
Try to make it friendly.
was trying to incorporate elements of the culture to Christianity.
What makes Jesus special, you believe?
Well, number one, he was a real person, I think. I don't think, I'm not a mythicist. I do think he's a real person. I think he had a unique story. He lived in Nazareth in Judea, and the other gods can't necessarily say that. Also, at the same time, I do think when people are writing the Gospels, they're making them legend. So Alexander the Great, real person. Julius Caesar, real person. But when you read Suetonius and when you read the Life Greek Alexander romance, you're going to see there are stories of gods being applied to these real people. So even though, yes, Jesus is completely, in his own right, completely unique and a real story that people need to separate from these other Dionysus and stuff, we got to keep in mind when stories are being written, there's a tendency to do mimesis. There's the tendency to take legends and do a counter, like polemics. So you might have, there's legends of Dionysus, or not Dionysus, legends of the priest of Dionysus taking empty jars and putting them in a temple. So Aristotle writes about this. Pausanias writes about this. There's a bunch of sources that write about this. And they look back in the temple the next day and it's filled with wine. Well, then you look at Pliny the Elder, who says this happened on January 6th, called Theodosia. And then you look at church tradition, and they say the wedding of Cana happened on the night of January 5th, heading into January 6th. So you're like, okay, yes, Jesus is not the same as these other gods. We shouldn't just put him as a type of a dying and rising God. But I also want people to know that a lot of the culture is being reapplied and reshaped and remodeled. And I don't think Jesus necessarily gets to sort of be completely separated from this stuff.
No, that is very legit. And I think a lot of people need to look at this in the eyes. But what I found unique, and brings us back to Gnosticism, what I find unique about Jesus as a myth, if you will, is that he, unlike the other gods, brings a solution to a relatively new problem of the era, which was the Gnostic problem, the Gnostic predicament. So what I find unique about Gnosticism and what unifies all these various sects and cults that you talk about is a novel, historically, nihilistic, world-denying worldview.
In Gnosticism?
In Gnosticism.
Okay.
So
you're saying like the majority of these groups?
The majority of this group. Gnosticism comes...
It's very Orphic, like where there's a body and soul.
There's a body and soul.
Soul's good.
But the basic Orphic myth is that we humans are dual in nature.
Yeah.
We have a spirit, a soul, that is a little part of God.
Yeah, a little spark of divinity.
A little spark of divinity.
Yeah.
And this spark of divinity gets through error, through something that should not have been, trapped into this material flesh.
Yeah.
Life is seen as a prison. Life is seen as the domain of decadence, of corruption, where, of death, old age, pain, suffering, the veil of tears. And the gnosis that you mentioned is the secret knowledge that all this is happening first, and then the secret knowledge
liberates you.
Getting out of here.
Liberation. Yeah.
There is, and you read some of the Gnostic hymns, and they speak with the uttermost disgust about this
yes,
human flesh. something that you will not find in the preceding religions, where the human flesh was honored in the great Greek sculptures.
Yeah.
You know, the human flesh, all bones and synesis, was a vehicle of divinity. But when the Gnostic turn happens, late Hellenistic, early Roman, and then till the late Roman, all the century before and after Jesus Christ, essentially, it's where Gnosticism comes to the fore. You have this world-denying worldview, which is fascinating. And the way I describe it is, you know how our scientists are trying to communicate with dolphins. The scientists try to communicate with dolphins. Now they're using AI. So if we were to imagine some of these scientists actually succeeding and actually having a full conversation with a dolphin, the way we're having a full conversation now, and you ask the question to the dolphin, said, you know, what is your life's greatest problem? You know, what is your greatest trouble, your greatest struggle in life? And imagine if the dolphin was to come back and say, it's water. It's being a dolphin. We shouldn't be dolphins. We should be birds. This water life is disgusting to us. You'd be like, how? You know, we thought you were one with nature. We kind of envy animals of being so in tune with nature. And you're telling us that you shouldn't be a dolphin, you should be a bird. But that is Gnosticism.
Yes.
That is Gnosticism.
It's a lot of Gnostics that do that, and I agree with you. And that is, I think some of this go back to Plato too, where Plato was sort of, in Republic, for example, he's expressing his disgust for Homer and the poets, and saying that children need to be brought up thinking that the next life is going to be good, because Homer was famous for teaching, don't look forward to Hades. It's gloomy. It's not fun. He says Achilles is there right now, and he's whining about being there, and he wishes he could come back to this life, enjoy life. This is why Nietzsche was big into the classics, and these people really, what's the word?
They embrace
life. This is like the old classical Greek way of looking at life as the most amazing thing.
Yeah.
And Hades, nah. They don't. There's torture, but it's like, don't look forward to it. Look forward to right now.
Yeah.
Whereas Plato, and then later the Christians,
opens up this possibility.
Heaven's going to be way better than this. This is not good. So then you get more extreme versions of that, like these Gnostics saying, well, yeah, that's because we're trapped in these bodies and everything's suffering. But later, when we do these things, we're going to be free. So I think a lot of it goes to that. Also, you're sort of walking into this whole idea of like life affirming versus life denying, which brings us sort of back to the classical religions of ancient Greece, which was the difference between religion today and religion back then. I personally think that a lot of these older, more local traditions were life affirming. Yeah.
But this is what I'm saying about Christianity. All this talk about the connection between Christianity and Gnosticism is nonsensical.
But do you think
Christianity is a Gnostic religion?
Yeah, that's what Elaine Pagel says. I agree with this.
Yeah.
Paul, most of the Gnostics, quote unquote Gnostics, read Paul.
Yeah,
they were Pauline Christians.
Exactly.
But you mentioned something that I want to get back to. You said Jesus sort of answered that question.
Yeah.
I'm curious because I think he sort of went along with this, I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Well, my thinking, like if reading as you have a lot of Gnosticism, the idea is that we're being abandoned here.
Yeah.
There's a sense
the demiurge created this world and it's not perfect. It's all suffering.
Yeah. There's a sense of abandonment, waiting for God, waiting for a rope to be thrown to us.
Salvation.
And there you have it. Jesus is that rope. It's one of these ideas that is so common, so close to us, that we fail to understand the brilliance of the idea that God sent his only begotten Son, an incarnation of himself, to live and die a human death and experience the suffering, experience this life.
Sure.
Even doubting that he's God. Like in the Garden of Gethsemane, there's this, Jesus is feels abandoned himself, like we all do. Despite a lot of Christian theology that tried to do away with this scene, there's this beautiful scene that even Jesus, says to God the Father, "Why have you abandoned me?" Well, this is the Gnostic predicament, being abandoned by God.
Yeah.
And yet Jesus is God, as perhaps we all are. Who knows?
Right.
And so you have a direct way out of here in historical time.
You're right.
God finally sends the rope and pulls you back.
So you're saying the orthodox answer was, forget about all this gnosis. It's really complicated. Just have faith, and then you're in. And it's a little more simpler answer to this predicament that they're all in.
Yeah.
But what I say is,
it's a simple...
I think all of it is sort of bringing people into a direction that, as we pointed out, life denying.
Yeah.
The Nietzsche's Life of Tragedy is like one of the most mind-blowing, amazing books I've ever read.
The Birth of Tragedy, yeah.
He really gets into like this idea of before Christianity, we had this Apollonian Dionysian duality, and there was art, and people were driven by art and the music and the muse, and it was life affirming, and it was life is tragedy, but it's beautiful, and that's what he really expresses in that book. But then you look at the Christian answer to life, and it's, to me, it's just like
it's comedy.
Yeah, but it's almost
no. Listen, it's comedy in the way that the Divine Comedy from Dante is comedy. The ancients knew two genres. They knew tragedy and comedy. If it's not tragedy, it's comedy.
Yeah.
You read Inferno, and it's not funny at all. You read the whole Divine Comedy, it's not funny. But he called it comedy because it was not a tragedy, because everyone gets saved at the end.
Yeah, and that is funny, if that's true.
It's funny.
That would be a comedy. If
it would be
all
a comedy.
of this was just like, well,
a play. And in your deepest of troubles, finally,
that's mind-blowing.
The curtain gets, and all your friends are there, and you're like, surprise.
Yeah.
That is a comedy, in a way.
Yeah. But then this is the image of the satyr that Nietzsche brings up. And the satyr is like this image of life, of nature.
Yeah,
you're part in nature.
In a tragic sense.
One of the things Bexis was telling me, and I really thought I'm gonna take this with me, was he was pointing out that in Judeo-Christian thought, we are the masters of nature. God gave us domain over all the animals and all the plants and all this. But in his view, we're just a part of nature. We don't have domain over it. We're a part of it. We have to, when we sacrifice an animal to eat it, we have to remember that life was given so we can have life. And we're just a part of a give and take process.
But this is what I find so hard to reconnect to, because we forget how the very words we're using have been corrupted, or rather reformed by modern science.
Yeah.
We talked about words like energy. You wake up one morning today, you say, I'm very low on energy. And invariably, you think yourself almost like a battery.
Yes.
And you try to fill yourself up. Coffee, maybe some pill, maybe some potion, just put energy. Energy is something you have, you're empty, and you want to fill it back in. But if you think of energy in the way the word meant before modern science, which was Aristotelian, energy is one side of the duality of existence. For Aristotle, it's almost like everything that can exist does exist, but it's in a passive state. It's in a state of non-existence. It's endynami. It's a potentiality, but a potentiality was not an abstract thing, was a existent thing. Like things exist. All the children that you could have are here ingrained in the universe. Endynami, in potentiality. When you meet a woman and you have a child, you bring this child, you basically flip its state from potentiality to energy. So if you think about energy, what it means in this case, energy is the realization of a potential that is there waiting for you. So you wake up, you're low in energy. The Aristotelian question is, what am I supposed to be doing that I'm not doing? Hence, I'm feeling so low. Not how do I fill myself up with fake energy so I can go out and do things that perhaps I'm not even meant to be doing, which is the very rationalistic point of view. So Bexis talks about nature. Yes, okay, but I find that people understand nature in a very modern sense. Nature is out of the cities, is the trees and the forest, and and that's perhaps not how the ancient Greeks would think of nature.
Mm-mm.
The ancient Greeks worshipped gods who were gods of nature, but who were gods of the city.
Yes, yes.
Athena was goddess of the city.
Polis.
And now we have this divide, the city and the countryside, and nature is in the latter rather than the former, So this is why I find a lot of these efforts that are so difficult trying to reconnect with paganism. Even our language is anti-pagan.
But
and with that language, you try to express.
You brought up a good point, and it brings us back to going forward. And I guess this is like sort of tying it all together, is like, you have these old religions that everyone's trying to go back to, including myself. I'm very fascinated by them. And then you have the current states, which is here in Greece is Orthodoxy and Catholicism in the West. And then there's different Christian groups, and then Islam in the East, and there's Judaism. These are all active religions that have generations going back. They have doctrines, they have textbooks, they have ways of doing things, they have dogmas. And then it's like, which one, can they coexist, or is there another path that needs to happen? What's the future? That's the question that we're both looking at right now.
Yeah. I always feel there is a future, and an aspect of this just popped into my mind, so I think it might be a good segue, is in this great effort, and often I'm sad to say, but I have to, the only glimpse that I've got of how a new revelation, a new experience of the divine could look is through psychedelics.
Thank you for saying that. This has been my thing. I do think that we've so demonized this thing, and they're for good reason. They're very dangerous. People shouldn't just have taken them in the backyard of their house. But people have reported, including myself, I talked about this on my channel, spiritual awakenings through taking psychedelics. The founder of AA, Bill W., his name was one of these people who was going out and doing LSD, and he had a spiritual.
Wow.
Yes, this is
no
written in the biography of Bill W. The founder of Alcoholics Anonymous had a spiritual awakening through LSD that got him sober, and he wrote this down. And he even included the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I know this for a good reason. I've been through these steps. The 12th step is to go out and have a spiritual awakening.
Okay.
It doesn't necessarily mean you have to do psychedelics. But they really promote like joining a religion, joining Christianity, join that, find a God, find a God of understanding. But I don't think that was what Bill intended. I think Bill was really serious when he said some people might have to try there might be some sort of closed way or safe way, medically induced or whatever, for people to experience something that they've never experienced before, that can give them a different a viewpoint. Different standpoint of where they are.
And for most people who think psychedelics is just another drug, the person who was like the founder of a detox movement being inspired by drugs is a contradiction in terms. But obviously, once you experience both of these substances, you understand how different they are.
Yeah, and okay, so in the modern world, people have reported, including myself, having experiences that changed their lives on psychedelics. And I'm not forgetting that other people have had really rough experiences that might have ruined their lives. I'm sure we need to bring both to the table. But then we look at ancient religions, as we've been talking about in this discussion, and you can see a lot of these ancient traditions had some form of a psychedelic. In Eleusis, they drank the kukion. In the Persian tradition of the Magi, they drank the haoma drink. There's even evidence that the temple of Yahweh in Elephantine also drank the haoma. Then you go to India, they drank the soma. There's another drink called kumba, I think kuba, that the Scythians would drink. It's like fermented milk. By the way, all of these are not the same. They're not prepared the same way. Kukion is not the same as haoma. Haoma is not the same as soma. Soma is not the same as kuba. They're all different. The Celts drank a form of mead that was magical, that they used like honey or something to make it. And like they put them in altered states of consciousness. The priests would take them and they would, whatever. But the point is, I'm noticing they're all united, even though they're different recipes, but they united in the sense that they all were using some sort of sacred beverage
Yes.
to get to this. And in Peru, you have ayahuasca. Even to this
Yeah.
day, they're still doing that.
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned soma, and when I first heard that in the Vedas you have mention of the soma, immediately I thought it's probably mentioned in one verse, and some
No,
hippie
all
took,
over the
and it's
Vedas.
all over the place.
Anyone
You
who's read the
read-
Vedas will tell you every page it's mentioned 20 times.
It's mentioned 20 times.
Yeah.
And they even make a distinction between the special ones who are the pressers of the soma
It's pressed, yeah.
and the common. It's like what separates the common people from the knowers is
Yeah.
that knowledge of the soma.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. I was very surprised
in fact,
to read it.
Those drinks that I mentioned, kukeon, soma, haoma, and kuba, are all cognates. So they
Okay.
have the same name for different ways of making a beverage. So it's not the name of the beverage that they're calling it. They're basically calling it divine drink.
Divine
different
drink.
languages,
Yeah,
and they
yeah,
make
yeah,
it differently.
yeah.
But if you trace back their Indo-European root of that word, it goes back to the word kehu. I don't know how to pronounce it right, but it's spelled like Khew and with the little asterisks.
Yeah.
You know how Indo-European words are?
Yeah, like reconstructed.
And the word is also cognate with the English word God is cognate with this word, which tells us this is going back very far. This is a divine process that these Indo-Europeans were.
Which is interesting because, you know, the word, a lot of people think that the word theos in Greek is almost a cognate to Zeus because it sounds so similar. And it's not.
Yeah.
And it's not.
And I always thought it was until Luke Ranieri, the Greek expert, was
and
like,
word,
nope.
And the word theos is really of strange
Because
origins.
you get Deos, which is from sky.
Yeah.
And Theos is like some sort of theos or something different.
Yeah. It sounds
they
very
just
similar.
happen to sound the same.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. And you know, there is this book, The Immortality Key, and I finally got to read it because it was.
I think it's pretty good.
I think it's a very good book. I think it's a very good book, but
it's one of those heavily criticized.
But I found it as well somewhat frustrating.
I agree with you, but I think he's asking good questions. Maybe not the answers that I agree with. I think the questions he's asking are on point. Of why can't we have these things in the modern world?
Yeah. Well, why can't we have this thing? And just segueing off that, I find that although we have had something that people call the psychedelic renaissance, right? People like Joe Rogan was a big player, you know, people, because, you know, we had the 60s and they used a lot of psychedelics, and then it went underground because it went so, it was a Schedule I drug, which means it was as illegal as heroin, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And then obviously when you push something on the fringes, the people who keep doing it are people on the fringes. They're marginal people.
Outcasts.
Yeah. So these drugs were associated with the outcast, you know, with crazy artists at best, madmen and criminals at worst.
Or mystics.
Self-proclaimed mystics. And then you have people, quote unquote, normal people who take these things, that go out, you know, and they're like, look at me, you know, I've got a job, got a great family, got a career, yet I also take psychedelics. And people went, wow, I didn't know that could happen. And we had something called the psychedelic renaissance. And at the same time, I saw moves pushing further into criminalization, like in 2012, right when people were starting to see these substances differently. In the United Kingdom, there was the 2012 Psychedelics Act, as it was called. What I found fascinating about the Psychedelics, and it's the first time I'm mentioning it, what I found fascinating about the Psychedelics Act is, if you want to criminalize a substance, you criminalize the substance. You write it on a black book. You say, you know, this molecule here is cocaine, and this is what we're criminalizing for X, Y, Z reasons. But the 2012 Psychedelics Act came right around the time when people were doing all these derivatives from LSD, you know.
LSA, LS1. I remember that.
So somehow they wanted to bundle everything together. So they have a description of essentially
just tweak it a little bit, and it's not illegal anymore.
Yeah. So what they were trying to do is make all these substances illegal. So what they did was really crazy. They have a description. What they're criminalizing essentially is any substance that can give you a certain description of effects, which we call the psychedelic experience. So essentially, they're criminalizing an experience. They're not criminalizing, which is crazy. It's like criminalizing, I don't know, falling in love. They're criminalizing
The experience.
the experience
That's interesting.
rather than a substance, which you wouldn't think they can even do that.
Right.
But it's obviously this experience that they're somehow afraid of all the problems
It's interesting.
that the world has. Is that what they're so it makes you think a little conspiratorially.
Well, I know. I was going to say that people do think there's something.
Yeah.
But then you think, is the negative effects, people having bad trips and waking up in the hospital, does that outweigh the positive of people having spiritual awakenings and changing their lives?
It comes to a country where I've lived in the UK. You go to a hospital on a Friday and you think you're after like a war. You have a line of people that just came from the pub and they're bleeding from all sides of their face because they were in fist fights or they just stripped and
alcohol is completely legal.
And alcohol is completely legal. It's a
and driving around on alcohol, killing people.
Yeah. So you are like a UK lawmaker. You see the effect that alcohol has on your society, and you think that psychedelics are your problem.
Right.
It's weird. It makes you flirt with some conspiracy theories, as if the lawmaker had some relation with, Agent Smith from The Matrix, where, he just doesn't want you to find the secret.
Yeah, I mean, because you makes you think, what would happen if thousands to, hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of people started to have these awakenings and start thinking differently about capitalism and being in a rat race and why do I work 9 to 5 when I can be out here doing that? And then that might be a problem for the system. Well, they need you to work somewhere. You need to be part of you need one of the cogs of this system. Where people might, I forgot his name from the 60s, who said famously, drop out and...
Timothy Leary.
Timothy Leary, what was it saying? We wanted people to
tune in, drop out.
Yeah. And if everyone started doing that, that's not good.
No,
so you can see the angle of the so-called conspiracy.
You can see the angle. I think you put it correctly, because you don't have to theorize about some kind of dark cabal that are trying to hide. I think that systems it's like capitalism.
You want a system where people drink caffeine.
They have a sort of intelligence. Systems have a sort of consciousness.
Yeah, you want people to be caffeined up, working 9 hours, and then go home and take a couple drinks and calm down, go to bed, do it again the next day. That's what you want. Those drugs, caffeine and alcohol, work great for our system. But psychedelics, that's going to make people be doing something different. They're not going to want it. So I think that's what answers that question.
And yet, to play devil's advocate, again, there's a book by a psychologist called James Hillman, and it's called something like "We had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world is getting worse," something like that. It's the title that I found fascinating, because it's true. It's true. We have had it, and I can say similar things about psychedelics. We had like 50 years of psychedelics and the world is getting worse. In that, despite all these awakenings, sometimes if you follow this psychedelic renaissance, if you just watch too much Joe Rogan or whatever, you think that something's happening, something great.
And sometimes it's dark.
And it
brings you to places that are not necessarily awakenings, more falling asleep.
Yeah, exactly. You look outside your window, you look at what's happening, and you're like, are people more awake or conscious or unaware of what's happening?
This is kind of what Brian Muraresku was getting at, was if you took this thing and brought it back to the religious aspect rather than the partying aspect, what can that open? That could be the key.
So there's a missing component.
Key.
Exactly.
But when we look at Eleusis is so fascinating to me, because even though it was secretive and we don't have a lot of primary sources of what went on in there's only a few texts that actually describe the events. One thing that they always say all across the board, Cicero was one of the people who pointed this out, is that people went to this thing, it transformed their lives, they no longer feared death, and they felt like everything was good. That sounds like something that would be good for society. Something that people can go to that can transform their lives, and they no longer fear death, and they're saved from it. How do we get that back?
A rational way back to that.
Controlled
way back to that, because I think it's only half of the issue. it's taking that experience and placing it inside of a new theology that can give you, you need the practice, you need the theory. And what I would be very fascinating, because just opening up a very personal aspect of, my experiences, and there've only been few, but on the higher dosage ladder. And one of the things that I always crave during this experience is to communicate them, because if you are on a trip, as we say, with other people, usually everyone's in their own trip. And it's very hard to communicate. You're seeing something, you're thinking of something, you're experiencing something of great beauty right here, right now. And you want to go, like children do, look at that. And someone's on their own trip, they're crying over something. And so I think part of a psychedelic science would be to navigate these spaces, to be able to find a map of the territory, rather than rehashing of, because I've heard enough of Terence McKenna, I've heard enough of these people, and they're all fascinating, and they're all very poetic, but they're all stuck in this kind of loop of, we don't know what it is, it's fascinating, could be aliens, could be beings from another dimension, could be the ancient gods coming back, could be your dead ancestors, could be this, could be that, but it's fascinating, but it could be this, but it could be that. So
it's still a question that hasn't been answered yet.
It's still a question, it hasn't been answered,
but it
and
makes
yet you can't let go.
But it makes you wonder, did the Eleusinian hierophants, or priesthood of Eleusinians, did they have the same question of why is it? I don't think so. They seem to be doing it the right way.
No, because when they went out of it, they felt like they experienced something they've been hearing all their lives.
Something fulfilling about it.
Yeah, and something.
And that's what I'm wondering is, where, like you said, Terence McKenna and all these people are just, what is this? Is it working? Is it not?
Yeah.
But like, is there a way out of that? Is there a way to answer that question?
I don't know, but it's worth trying.
Yeah.
It's worth trying. It's worth trying, finding our way back to the mysteries of Eleusis.
I think what you're pointing out is, and you went in the direction I wasn't expecting, but I think that it might be something very important for how we do religion going forward.
Mm-hmm.
How do we answer the question that, how do we fix Nietzsche's problem of the proclamation of the death of God? Mm-hmm. How do we bring back God into our society in a rational way, but also life-affirming, also something that people can look forward to? Mm-hmm. And is it the psychedelics? I don't know. Maybe that's just one aspect. Maybe there's more than that.
I think it's one aspect, but it's very much about reading the times. Like we talked about, if you go back to the early Christians, it's very much, you find there was an existential condition that we call Gnosticism, and Christianity comes out of it with like a new message, So there's an existential condition of the early 21st century.
And just to sort of highlight the dark side of that, psychedelics, and tie it to Gnosticism, there was a report in Hippolytus's Against Heresies of the successor of Valentinus, whose name was Marcus the Magus. Mm-hmm. And he, supposedly his sect called the Marcosians, there were Valentinians that went into this group. The Valentinians that broke off into another group called the Marcosians, and they settled in France, modern-day France, Gaul at the time. This guy got charged with adding a purple drug, purple pharmacon, to the Eucharist, and was giving it to women so that they can have an experience and talk to what he mentioned was the graces. It didn't say to talk to Christ. It said to talk to the graces, the charis. I'm thinking, wow. And but like they were talking about it in a negative way. This guy was he was performing magical tricks. He was putting one cup here, he had another cup behind him, and he was adding drugs, and he was making these women trip out, and they were prophesying, but it's all fake. But I'm thinking to myself, I wonder what they thought of this. I wonder if this was like some other Eleusinian Christian type of thing going on. But that could be that would be really bad if someone was drugging Eucharist and giving people without their will, without their knowing. So like, it's just, but you can see it's right there in the heart of it, right in the middle of the Eucharist.
It's right there in the heart. For me, the limits to this fascination with psychedelics, which I'll obviously share, is once you understand something that Carl Jung said, and Carl Jung, I don't remember which passage, but Carl Jung said explicitly. He said there is no better tool for convincing people about the truth of the scientific materialist worldview. So not the spiritual world, the scientific, than psychedelics. Because if psychedelics can give you an experience that is invariably described as divine, mystical, metaphysical, godlike, and psychedelics are a chemical compound, then
It's all chemicals.
it's all chemicals.
And that's
the trap.
Scary and
That's the trap
fascinating at
right
the same
there.
time.
It's scary. It's fascinating only if you start to think of matter differently. If you think of matter the way the modern scientists insist, that it's all out there floating in a meaningless vacuum, then it becomes scary. If you want to, you talked about like the Gospel of Mary, right?
Yeah.
And I understand we only have a fragment, but the fragment that we have
There is a lot in there.
Opens up, literally, like imagine, like for a modern Christian who doesn't know a lot about these alternatives, you have the scene where Mary Magdalene is sitting with Jesus, the Master, and asks Jesus, what is matter? Matter, like the material world. What strange question to ask Jesus.
Yeah.
Right? But not if you consider that Gnostic point of view of matter as being the trap.
And
right?
in that same text, she also asked, what is sin? And strangely, he says, there is no sin.
Yes.
You just call it that.
Yes.
What?
Yeah.
What is going?
Yeah.
That like completely changes everything, you know.
Yeah.
But like, there's something. This is a very spiritual text, obviously.
Yeah. So to me, everything we talk about, there are elements, they're very powerful elements to know these things, but they're elements waiting for center, if you will, to be united, which is what I call the new revelation. There's.
Do you see it coming anytime soon? What are your thoughts on the?
It's unpredictable. That's the thing.
Yeah.
That's the thing. If you were predicted, it wouldn't be a revelation.
You think we are right now in a state of limbo, where you have the old ways and the current ways, but like we're just actually just waiting for something new.
Yeah, and it's the idea of form versus content. It's the idea of something. It's not necessarily a new thing, right? It's a new form that brings, the things that are going to compose it are there. I'm convinced that this, whatever new, call it religion, for lack of a better term, is going to come. It's going to include psychedelics. It's going to include this sort of pantheism that you see so prevalent in the New Age movements.
Yeah.
It's going to include elements of Christianity. It's going to include, but all these are going to be building blocks, and the form is going to be radically new. And it's that form, like Christianity is a form. The god of wine, who might have been Dionysus, the Eucharist, the dying and resurrecting.
You are still reaching back to the past.
Yeah,
but
all
also
these things
moving forward.
is matter. What makes Christianity is the form these things take.
Yeah. Because a lot of successful religions are linked to their past.
Yeah.
They go back to the ancient prophets. They go back to some, patriarchal father.
Yeah.
That's what they usually all have in common.
Yeah.
And then you look at like these newer religions like Scientology that tries to
which is very Gnostic in a way.
It is very Gnostic, yeah. But it's trying to really be futuristic and Dianetics and aliens and this and that. And I don't know if I call it a successful religion. It's got a lot of money, but I just don't know if that's going to be.
It hit a chord. It hit a chord with a lot of people.
Sure.
And that's enough to take notice.
Yeah.
It's like every fashion, every trend, everything. If it hits a chord, it means something. It means there's something there.
I don't know. I just feel like people are, no matter what year it is, if it's 5,000 AD or 10,000 AD, people are always going to be obsessed with the past because it's the only thing that we can look back at with certainty. Not certainty. It's the only thing we can look at. The future is just uncertainty. The past is not certainty, but it's like there's something we can look at, and there's always going to be a fascination with it. And I think that's where you draw from as a sort of
you move forward by looking back. So that brings us, I guess, moving to the closure of this great discussion. Like, what does the future hold for the Gnostic Informant?
Well, I am, I've been discussing my sort of transformation from when I was a Christian to thinking about early Christian groups and Gnosticism and calling myself a Gnostic, and then moving away from that, and then sort of becoming just agnostic, maybe even atheist for a while. And then in the last year to 2 years, or maybe a little longer than that, the year to 2 years roughly, believing that there's something that brings us inspiration, which the ancients called the muse. And my going forward is, what do I do about that? Do I start calling myself a pagan? Do I join a cult? What do I do? And that's going to be the future for myself, is to figure out what that even means to believe in inspiration. And that's, I'm going to have to navigate that however I do.
I think it's a wonderful place to be, and I know it can be a painful place to be, but if I have half an advice to give, it's like, you should stick with the pain. No one said. I remember reading a book by called The Irrational Man, which is a very, very fascinating book about existentialism. If you want a truly existentialist primer, that's the book. And he's talking about a lot of fascinating things. And he says he's talking about the muse and how I don't remember who he was referring to, but one of the greats who was talking about the muse. And then, almost as a side note, the author says, surely all this sounds as nothing but a metaphor, but that is only a metaphor for those who have really never experienced such divine madness themselves. So it's like, it all sounds very poetic, very gentle, or the muse, but it's like, I think Tolstoy said, love is a harsh and terrible thing. In reality, in contrast to love in dreams. The inspiration of the muse it can be very harsh. In comparison.
That's fascinating. Let me ask you one more question too. Is what do you think about because I think maybe you don't agree with this. I think the younger generation is on its way out of traditional Christian religion, and I do think there's been more and more interest in some other thing, the alternatives. What do you see going forward in the next, let's say, century or so? What are your thoughts on that? Maybe just here in Greece or something.
Here in Greece, and I've been talking about this with my wife yesterday. To get a glimpse, you have to look at the underdog, right? So it's a bit of a segue, but I'm trying to get to that point.
Sure.
It's like, I'm very fascinated about the people who can see marginal trends and recognize them. So imagine hip hop, right? It's a huge, like, multi-trillion-dollar industry. Like, you go back to the time it started, probably in the early 70s.
Late 70s,
You take like a well-to-do musical producer and you drag him to some kind of corner of New York.
Or they're beatboxing and doing break dancing. That's the late 70s, right?
You take them there to a black neighborhood. He's afraid to walk there, and you point to some guy. He's got a scar on his face. He's been 3 years in prison. He's a pimp. He's a criminal. He deals with drugs. His voice is like muffled from 1,000 joints, and he's like speaking rhythmically. He's doing something weird there. And you try telling him that's the future. That's the music your kids are going to
see it.
They wouldn't see it. They wouldn't see it. Some did.
Some did.
And became, billionaires. Some did. So I'm always like, I've trained my eyes to look at the fringes differently. The way things look now, like, you see a lot of the new pagans, and I understand they might look funny to most people.
Couldn't agree more.
How do you think, like, the early hip hoppers look?
Right.
Ridiculous. Like who cares about these people? And yet,
like, I see these groups online, and they can look a little bizarre.
Very.
You can see that there's a community that is
there's something there. So you're asking me, I'm trying to find that angle there. I'm looking at this community that I'm in more and more frequent contact with. I'm not there myself. You know, I don't have their practices for sure, and most of their beliefs. I have more disagreements
Sure.
philosophically than I have agreements. But I look at them and I see there's an authenticity there. And I'm trying to see the hip hop success story out of these
Interesting.
half crazy, some like in the middle of a midlife crisis, some have a grudge against Christianity because they feel it repressed their sexuality.
Yes.
Some, it's like, you know, all these group that from an outsider might look ridiculous.
But, and just to tie this, just to end this off, because eventually hip hop became commercial and then became friendly to the household.
Yeah.
Is that what's going to happen with all these chaotic pagan online groups?
Yeah,
Maybe that's
you
what needs to
need
happen.
to find the angle,
The commercializing
of where that is going to fit, because hip hop,
which the original old heads of this movement are not going to like it.
No,
but
no.
it's going to make it grow.
Exactly.
They won't like it, but it's going to work for them.
Exactly, because hip hop filled some kind of gap, filled some kind of need,
and just
which is hard to express.
And just to finish this off, to go back to our original, this is all perfectly tying together. That's what happened with Christianity.
Exactly.
It became corporatized.
Exactly.
The
exactly.
Romans stepped in,
Exactly.
Constantine and Theodosius, and they commercialized it and they made it into a corporation.
Exactly.
And all the Gnostic groups fell aside. Is that what's going to happen?
Again, the hip hop, like the gangster sitting at the corner of a New York street in the 70s, the early Christian, former slave, half Greek, half Scythian, who knows, living in rags. Try telling a Roman noble that he's the future.
Right.
And yet he was the future. Someone like Paul, you know, that's what is needed. Someone like Paul
will step up and take this thing and move it to the next generation.
Someone like Paul, who in a you know, like American comedy film would be some like a marketing CEO type person, and he's going to look at all these movements and say, you know, I know what needs to be done here. Like a Ray Kroc. You need what Ray Kroc saw in McDonald's. You want the Ray Kroc for paganism.
I think well said. I think you're right.
So my man, it's been great. Like I always say with people, I enjoy conversations very much. It's only the beginning of a fruitful spiritual relationship. Thank you very much for doing this. Thank you very much for being here. I understand you were here for your own purposes as well, but it's great taking the time and place. And we'll keep on this path, I think.
Yeah.
It feels like both of us.
And I always tell my audience at the end, you have just attained true gnosis.
Perhaps so. Perhaps so. So, you know, what I always say on my audience is thank you very much. And much more mundane. Please like and subscribe and share this video and consider supporting us on Patreon.
And if you're watching this on my end, make sure you hit the links in the description for Ancient Greece Revisited.
Thank you very much, man. So thanks everyone for watching.